Kia ora koutou katoa. He mihi nui kia koutou, kua tau mai tēnei hui, waha. And a very warm welcome to Debashish and Priya, our guest speakers today, who are joining us all the way from London. I don't know what time of the night it is over there, but just a huge thank you to both of you for making yourself available to provide this online briefing about your research today. And a warm welcome as well to our hubs that are joining us from around the motu. Before we get into the content, just a little bit of housekeeping, particularly with Zoom. If you are in a physical hub and we can't see you, you don't have a little visual screen, can you send me a note via the chat panel on Zoom, and I can promote you to a panelist so that we're able to see the people in your room. If you can't figure out how to use the chat function, you can send me an email, or which you will have received via the Zoom registration, or you know, all the thousands of ways you can get in contact with me. In terms of the way we work with Zoom, what we're going to do today is have a half-an-hour presentation thereabouts. We've just got people coming and going, so apologies for the background noise here. We'll have half an hour of questions and then half an hour of presentation, and then we'll open it out for questions. There are a few different ways to ask questions on Zoom. The easiest way is to open the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom screen and ask a question via the question and answer panel, and that will let me moderate the questions. But if you're in a physical hub and you obviously don't have access to the chat panel, what you can do is raise your hand wildly, and we can see you, and then we'll unmute the room. And I'll try and keep a running list to make sure it's fair. Sometimes it gets a little bit out of hand, but hopefully we'll be okay. We do have quite a lot of people joining in today, and we're expecting a few different hubs. And this briefing, this end user stakeholder briefing, is also doubling as a media briefing. So we have people from local government, we have people from across the tourism sector, we have people from central government, and we have media with us today. So just for everyone to be aware of that, thank you very much for coming, all of you. Just to get Tony Rogers attended, just to get into the content of things, we're very excited to be finally at the stage of releasing Debashish and Priya's research. The research is embargoed until tomorrow, so tomorrow you'll be able to find a copy on our website, and hopefully it will be discussed in the media as well. This is the only research project in the Deep South Challenges engagement program. So this is research into the nature of engagement, which we know with climate adaptation is a key barrier to making change. Is how do we go about engaging our communities so that communities can take some action, so that the questions gain traction within the communities that actually have the power to do something about it. So without further ado, I will pass over to Debashish and Priya to introduce themselves and then to share their screen so that we can see their PowerPoint.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Greetings from a very, very wet London to all of you. My name is Debashish Munshi.
And I'm Priya Kurian.
We are the co-leaders of the project on tourism, culture and climate change adaptation that we will talk to you about today. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so the tourism sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand is an economic powerhouse, but it is vulnerable to global developments, as we can see in the current impacts on the industry by the outbreak of coronavirus, and we are all in the middle of it right now. And you can see how a slight change can affect the tourism industry in very big ways. And so what we are doing today is asking you to imagine a climate changed world and to see whether the tourism sector is really up to adapting to it. Now, this vulnerability is especially pronounced, as we're saying, in the face of advancing climate change. The country's tourism drawcards, such as beaches, mountains, and stunning landscapes, are all susceptible to climate change, as we are beginning to see with soaring temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, rising sea levels, and melting glaciers. But the question is the tourism sector adequately prepared to adapt to climate change? Before we delve into the details of our project, we would like to thank the Deep South National Science Challenge for funding this project. The aims of the project aligns directly with the Deep South Challenge's mission of enabling New Zealanders to adapt, manage risk, and thrive in a changing climate. Also, although the two of us are presenting the report today as principal investigators, the report has been put together by us in collaboration with Sandy Morrison, Lynn Kathleen, and Raven Cretney. We also acknowledge the work of two of our students, Cressida Rurinoi and Crystal Taufai, who completed their master's thesis as part of this project. And they contributed to the Maori case studies in the report, as you may have seen or will see. The project also brought together scientists and other researchers from various other programs of the challenge to engage with the tourism sector, and has also embedded the principles of Vision Aotearoa into every aspect of the research. We would also like to thank all those who've participated in the research, and of course, those of you who are present today.
So let's begin by talking about the context for the study. A changing and variable climate leads to shifts in patterns of tourism and tourist mobilities, and most specifically poses risks to a whole range of enterprises, tourism enterprises that are highly dependent on landscape and nature. There's a useful distinction that's made in the academic literature between primary, secondary, and tertiary climate impacts for tourism that you can see on the slide. At the primary level, the primary effects are those that have a direct impact on tourism activities, such as soaring temperatures, for instance. Secondary effects describe changes in the landscape or nature because of climate change, and tertiary effects encompass the impact of policies, such as those that are aimed at mitigation of emissions or impacts on tourism through changes in travel behaviors and patterns. So for a country that's so highly dependent on tourism like New Zealand, the stakes are quite significant, and the specific implications for this country include things as varied as the flooding of tourist hotspots due to unseasonal rain, increase in the frequency of drought in many regions, decrease in snowfall with consequent impacts on the ski industry, sea level rise, which can affect coastal areas, and higher than average temperatures, which can again have an impact on the quality of outdoor activities and so on. So despite an extensive range of research on climate change adaptation in New Zealand and detailed projections by Earth system modelers, progress on climate change adaptation has really been slow in the tourism sector, both because of immediate business priorities in the sector and a lack of coherent national strategies on how to respond to climate change. So this report that we are going to present today focuses on the question of what the state of play is with regard to climate change adaptation in the tourism sector in New Zealand, and also the question of how government and industry can collaborate to respond collectively and jointly to the impacts of climate change.
Now, in undertaking this project, we placed a particular emphasis on the idea of culture. This focus on culture is critical in synthesizing the knowledge of values, desires, practices, and life experiences with scientific knowledge. Indeed, as the well-known novelist and essayist Amitav Ghosh says in his landmark book, The Great Derangement, that climate change is not merely a crisis of nature, but more importantly, it is a crisis of culture. Responding to and adapting to climate change in any sector requires negotiating with competing understandings of the implications of climate change. At the heart of such a negotiation is acknowledging the notion of culture as a particular way of life which expresses certain meanings and values. A number of influential studies have made the case for a sharper focus on culture in the last decade. From this literature and our own research, we identify 4 key pillars of a culture-based understanding of climate change adaptation.
And so here we have just a snapshot of a matrix of culture comprising of these 4 pillars or 4 elements. The first that this matrix of culture involves is values. And values are a defining element of culture as they represent the beliefs, ideas, ideologies, and perspectives of a group of people about what is good or bad, or what is sustainable or unsustainable, what is desirable or undesirable. And so the ways in which people in a particular community, group, or subgroup make sense of a situation or respond to certain messages is shaped by their values. A second element of the matrix of culture is place. People have very close relationships to the land, including but just not limited to the land on which they live, the land and the space in which they work. And so at the heart of designing adaptation, climate adaptation policies is the notion of place attachment. So communities that have an intimate knowledge of their surroundings and are deeply aware of the impacts of climate change are best placed to co-lead and collaborate on the development of climate change adaptation policies. A third element of this culture matrix is power. And central to the management of adaptation processes are the dynamics of power, the power differentials that exist between groups of people, the exercise of power by certain community sectors or the business sector in the context of tourism in terms of taking proactive steps to shape adaptation to climate change. And also, of course, the use of power in ways that may not necessarily further the larger public good. And a fourth element of this matrix of culture is narrative. Stories are an important part of a culture-centered framework. Stories reinforce the relationship of people to place. And so how a community stories its past experiences and actions ultimately determines how it understands and practices future adaptation.
Now, let's take a look at this diagram, for instance, and this is what we've come up with as our framework, really. The 4 pillars of values, place, power, and narrative that Priya talked about, you can see, support. They are the foundation of this framework. And you'll see the lived experience of people, lived experience of diverse stakeholders. That's what leads to both indigenous and scientific knowledge. And it's the interplay of these 2 knowledges and the deliberative engagement that incorporates this knowledge that leads to diverse and contextual adaptation strategies. Now, one of the points that we want to specifically mention here is that, one-size-fits-all adaptation strategies are less likely to work in this situation. And that's why the importance of the culture-centered framework, so that we can plan on adaptation strategies depending on specific regions, specific contexts. One thing about the diagram that we would like to mention, though, is that this is a simple representation of the framework. It seems to show a linear pathway, but there are actually clearly multiple feedback loops within a system that integrate culture into climate change adaptation processes. Now, the interplay among values, place, power, and narrative discussed in the framework can actually be seen in the Maori approaches to climate change adaptation. Mātauranga Maori is the intergenerational knowledge encompassing Maori perspectives, worldviews, and cultural practices, which are used to understand the links between the tangible and the intangible, spiritual and metaphysical. Several researchers who worked on Maori environmental knowledge of climate and weather in New Zealand have shown that Maori community members were aware of imminent environmental events because of their accumulated knowledge of environmental indicators. A broad survey of the literature on Maori and climate change conducted by one of our students, indicates the importance of developing such a framework of public engagement on climate change adaptation. Interestingly, it also shows some significant gaps in the research, which include identifying and quantifying climate-related risks and hazards for inland Maori communities, and the effect of colonization on the adaptive capacity of Maori, including addressing the dispossession of Maori land in coastal communities and its effect on cultural identity. Given this project's emphasis on culture in designing a public engagement framework on climate adaptation, Iwi and Hapu perspectives on climate change have been an essential part of the project. And for that, we acknowledge the contribution of Sandy Morrison, as well as two of our master students, and also Thea King, who worked as a researcher for the project.
So a quick word on the methodologies that we used in working on this project. So the report draws on targeted engagement with the tourism operators, industry representatives, policy planners, government officials, in central and local government and community organizations, and including Maori communities. We began with interviews. The research team interviewed 30 people across both North and South Islands, and the interview methods included both face-to-face interviews and by telephone. The interviews covered a wide range of issues, including specific economic, social, and cultural risks of a rapidly changing climate, and the priorities that interviewees identified on planning and adaptation measures. From this, building on these interviews, we went on to 2 system mapping sessions. And the system mapping sessions involved participants from the tourism sector, and these were conducted over the Zoom platform over 2 separate days. And the maps that emerged from the systems mapping session provided a visual depiction of key actors and organizations that make up and influence a system, as well as their relationships to a given issue and to one another. So the systems mapping session and the maps that came from it also helped to distill some of the key issues on climate change and tourism, and helped identify certain leverage points, opportunities for collaboration, and breakages that could undermine effective achievement of climate adaptation goals. Following the system mapping sessions, we then organized a citizen stakeholder panel. And this was a national level panel that we held in Wellington for representatives of the key actors to engage with tourism professionals and business persons. The session was attended by 33 participants, which included climate scientists, industry executives, government officials, and representatives of tourism enterprises from the North and South Islands. About 25% of the participants identified as being of Maori heritage. And so in many ways, the citizen stakeholder panel provided an opportunity to put into practice the principles of the culture-centered framework that we had developed. Engagement with Maori participants was based on Kaupapa Maori principles, and the project team enlisted additional support of Kaupapa Maori researchers in the components of this project that involved Maori participants.
Now, to come to the findings in very broad terms, I mean, in this report and in this presentation, we are presenting actually a very broad overview of our project, and a lot of the intricate details will be evident in the peer-reviewed articles that the project will eventually come through with, and some are already in place. So to begin with, the perspectives on sustainability and climate change adaptation in the tourism sector vary considerably between sector-wide representative organizations and larger enterprises on the one hand, and smaller tourism operators on the other. Sustainability issues now make a frequent appearance in tourism industry reports and materials. There is an acknowledgement of the centrality of sustainability to tourism and a recognition of climate change as an important concern for the sector. However, despite these efforts, it's important to note that specific issues of climate change or climate change adaptation, more specifically, are not dealt with at any deep level or even explicitly. What this suggests, as was evident from our interviews as well, is that climate change and the need to adapt to it is not seen as a distinct issue, but instead tends to be subsumed within sustainability. There is certainly a huge awareness in New Zealand's tourism sector about the country's natural resources being its greatest asset, evident in its successful showcasing of the 100% pure brand over the last 20 years. The sector is also aware of the potential impact on the tourism sector of international climate mitigation and emission reducing policies on people's ability and or willingness to travel. But despite this recognition, there is significant uncertainty in the sector about both the specific impacts of climate change and what the sector might do immediately to prepare for these impacts.
So there are four major themes that emerge from our data on how the tourism industry is approaching climate impacts and the need for adaptation. And these themes that we'll elaborate on in the next few slides are risk and uncertainty, short-term considerations, challenges for the sector, and perceived opportunities in the face of such challenges. So if we start with risk and uncertainty, the ambivalence within the tourism sector towards climate change reflects in many ways an inadequate grasp of the risks facing the sector and the uncertainty around what the impacts would be like and where they would be. So if you start by looking at the citizenship stakeholder panel, this panel that we organized attracted people clearly with an interest in issues around climate change and tourism. And so the level of concern expressed by participants at the stakeholder panel was much higher than the levels that we encountered at the interview stage. But uncertainty was a major issue for the citizen stakeholder panel. As you can see from the figures on the slide, 60% of the participants expressed a high level of uncertainty about climate change generally, and over 55% of the participants felt a high degree of uncertainty regarding the impact of climate change on the tourism sector itself. Now, when we look instead at the interviews, many interviewees felt that there was little risk of climate change impacting the tourism industry specifically. There was a perception that came through in the interviews repeatedly that climate change would never stop anyone from coming. And that was a quote from an interviewee. And so this perceived lack of tangible impacts in the very immediate sense contributed to the feeling that climate change was something mostly to be discussed in the longer term, something that doesn't concern us right now. For the risk to be tangible, some believe that there would have to be more drastic climate impacts happening before it came onto the radar of the tourism sector. So the predominant focus of the tourism industry is on the here and now, leaving the more amorphous, seemingly more amorphous risks of climate change to others. Given that until, of course, this coronavirus sort of bursting on the scene, but until then, given that tourist numbers have actually been booming, there is little appetite in the sector to acknowledge that adaptation planning needs to anticipate the potential for large reductions in visitor numbers. A key message that was missing in all of these discussions that we had was the central importance of climate mitigation and adaptation to the long-term survival of the industry. One climate change expert that we spoke to remarked, quote, "There will soon be no serious tourism business that is not a carbon neutral business." But that reality was not evident in our interviews and sessions that we had.
The focus on the here and now that Priya mentioned is part of our second theme, which is short-term considerations. One of the particular challenges for the tourism sector is that it is made up of a large number of small and medium businesses that do not have the financial resources for infrastructure development or any form of longer-term planning. As one interviewee put it, many of the tourism operators don't see themselves as either primarily responsible for or even in any position to affect outcomes for the environment. Another stated that taking up adaptation measures is beyond the capacity of small businesses whose primary focus is finding a defined experience and delivering really well on that. So the short-term focus of many businesses is a challenge for local government as well, which is trying to deal with issues of infrastructure development. And you can see how the tourism sector is seen as a cutthroat business. You know, when the energy, as you can see from one of the interview quotes that we put up on the slides, when the energies are bringing in 50 hotel rooms and more tourist buses and more business to the downtown bakeries and stores and whatnot, adaptation is probably one of the further issues from the mind. So there is not much of a sense of urgency in the tourism sector to begin to adapting to a changing climate. As one tourism marketing professional said, other than in some ski fields, very little was actually happening in the realm of climate change adaptation. And as this particular interviewee said, I guess that's probably a horizon thing for most tourism businesses. Under-resourced to undertake large-scale infrastructure-related adaptation initiatives, most of the smaller businesses actually rely on the government to do the planning and spending. A South Island water-based tourism operator was quite candid in his views. He said, "I'm researching into electric boats at the moment, but I have to fund myself. It would be a lot easier if there was a mechanism to assist us in moving in those directions."
The research also, through these conversations, through the stakeholder sessions and so on, also identified a number of specific challenges that the sector faced from rapidly advancing climate change. And so among some of the broad challenges identified were a lack of a nationwide climate change adaptation strategy for the tourism sector, lack of widespread awareness and knowledge in the tourism sector about climate change impacts, a reluctance in the sector to face the reality of the science of climate change, a lack of coordinating mechanisms to address and adapt to climate change, lack of centralized funding mechanisms, the high cost of building infrastructure to protect against climate change, and uncertainty about where long-term investments are needed. In more specific terms, there were concerns about a number of potential threats to tourism ventures, including the risk of warmer temperatures leading to the advent of tropical and subtropical creatures, disease-carrying mosquitoes, for example, threats to native flora and fauna, and damaging the environment for outdoor activities. There were risks identified of unstable mountain conditions due to decreased snow affecting tracks and walkways, damaged beaches and damage to iconic scenery, flooding in caves, inability or the reluctance of tourists to travel to New Zealand because of the distance. But at the same time, so you have these challenges being identified, but there were also many in the industry who remained upbeat, quite literally upbeat about weathering the storm, as they put it. We heard from several interviewees who were quite optimistic of what climate change actually means for New Zealand. There were those who said that a drier East Coast and warmer waters are actually going to help attract more tourists to New Zealand. Even the retreating glaciers, there was a recognition that it diminished the possibilities for the guided walks that tourists at one time could take to the Fox Glacier or Franz Josef. But the tourism business overall was seen not to be affected because there's been a boost in the high-end helicopter tourism in the Alpine region. So one interviewee said, the helicopter companies are booming. They're doing very well because if you really want a glacier experience, you've got to go in a helicopter. And so there's little recognition in these kinds of comments about the increasing carbon intensity of such adaptive responses to climate change. Many in the citizen panel, however, felt that climate change was offering an opportunity for innovation and thinking of the future in terms of sustainability. And one significant opportunity that was identified was in the realm of cultural tourism, a goal that could be achieved by integrating cultural indigenous thinking in long-term tourism development planning. The cultural aspect was also highlighted by some who saw opportunities in terms of sharing stories around the impacts of climate change and around, quote, why we have had to adapt, why we are changing, and what we can do to participate in it, unquote.
Now, as we begin to end, just culling some insights from the project. First of all, although tourism is a key industry in New Zealand, there is actually no clear strategy in place to future-proof the industry in the face of advancing climate change. The tourism sector is riding high on booming tourist numbers, but is struggling to cope with inadequate infrastructure, which is made worse by the destruction of existing infrastructure due to severe weather-related disasters. While aware of the risks and challenges climate change poses to the industry at a general level, many in the sector are unable to prioritize climate change adaptation. As several researchers have also pointed out, undertaking adaptation can only happen if there is an underlying understanding of the context, risk, and science of climate change. Now, as we see it, a key component for understanding the context of and pathways to climate adaptation is culture. A focus on culture, therefore, is a crucial part of bringing together diverse stakeholders and different types of knowledge to pursue adaptation processes effectively. A culture-centered framework of public engagement on climate change adaptation built on the pillars, as we pointed out, of values, place, power, and narrative can be a useful guide for such processes. Emphasizing values other than merely short-term economic ones, for instance, can open up doors to alternative ways of doing tourism. Maori communities, for example, often rely on traditional knowledge for sustenance of life on Earth. According to Maori understandings of the world, humans and nature are intertwined, and there are strong relationships, indeed kinship, among people, animals, plants, rivers, mountains, and lakes. There was unanimity among participants that for tourists, a key element of a unique New Zealand experience is to appreciate the beauty of the landscape. The notion of place is not only something that evokes physical space, but the social and cultural connections with the natural world. Landscapes, the experience of rugged wilderness, mountains, snow, rivers, and lakes are central to tourism in New Zealand. From a public engagement point of view, narratives of climate change incorporating the challenges and the ways of adapting to such change is critical. While dense reports and data sheets are important sources of information, they don't always penetrate the minds and imaginations of people. In this regard, Maori communities in several parts of the country are reaching out to people by focusing on stories of the past and increasingly on retelling of old stories to reflect newer contexts. Acknowledging and understanding and dealing with power is also a critical element. We did two specific place-based studies which appear as little boxes, one in the Thames Coromandel region and the other in the Waitomo region. In Thames, for example, despite a vocal plea for climate action from significant sections of the community, including school children who've petitioned the council and the mayor, there has been a steadfast refusal to sign the local government climate declaration or commit to any kind of action. The notion of power is also reflected in how certain actors make infrastructure investment decisions and influence policy frameworks on the priorities of the tourism sector. One promising way to address this indifference or unwillingness to countenance real systemic change is through deliberative processes that have been shown to increase support for policy action on issues such as climate change. A focus on participation, inclusion, and reciprocity makes it open to all forms of knowledge, including local knowledge, and is most likely to have just policy outcomes.
And so here we just want to briefly touch on how the interplay of knowledge traditions can work. Research that's been done and that is currently being done by Deep South scientists, for instance, have produced empirical evidence of global temperature rise and sea level rise and so on, and also climate modeling exercises, which help illustrate the specific implications of climate change for New Zealand. Alongside this, we have local knowledge from tourism operators, we have indigenous knowledge of Maori communities, and we have foundational Maori cultural concepts, among others, whakapapa, kaitiakitanga, whānautanga, and Maori. And it's the interplay of these knowledge traditions in a deliberative context that we believe can lead to the creation of climate adaptation policies.
Now, finally, we have in our report two sets of recommendations, one for policymakers and the other for tourism professionals. Very briefly, the recommendations for policymakers. The first is to investigate the development of a national strategy for climate change adaptation in the tourism sector. In addition, there is a need for place-specific and co-designed strategies at a regional scale that are developed alongside the tourism sector, local communities, iwi, and hapu. These strategies need to consider regionally targeted knowledge building and specifically include a focus on the importance of Maori knowledge and values in underpinning adaptation strategies. And the second one is increase and strengthen the communication of climate change data and information in order to contribute to awareness of adaptation needs in the tourism sector and the design and implementation of specific and contextual adaptation plans, not generic ones.
And our last slide for this presentation, and these are some recommendations for tourism professionals and operators. One, to incorporate climate change adaptation explicitly into the New Zealand tourism sustainability commitment within the industry. And one way of thinking about this would be to think about incorporating a commitment to climate change adaptation into the very vision of the statement so that it underpins all elements of the sustainability commitment. It's not merely an environmental issue, it subsumes all aspects of the sustainability commitment. A second is to include climate change adaptation into the framework for sustainable growth for tourism in the future. And what this would mean is actually starting to think about the nature of growth and whether in fact growth is sustainable and what that might mean in the context of climate change. And three, investigate different adaptation strategies for a diverse range and scale of tourism operations, including diversifying experiences, education for tourists, promoting cultural tourism, and collaborating with iwi and local communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debashish and Priya, and thank you for sharing your screen. We have a couple of questions already in, but just to refresh everyone's minds, if you have a question and you're in a physical room, just please raise your hand. If you're in the Zoom chat, you can either type your question in the question and answer panel, please not in the chat panel, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and I'll unmute you. But the first question is from Demelza Jackson, a journalist, and she asks, how devastating would the impacts be if the sector doesn't adapt?
I think the existing kind of climate change impacts are already such that we can see that it is going to have a major impact on tourism. I mean, if we look at the conversation that's happening around tourism today, there is talk about what's called peak tourism, right? I mean, tourist numbers growing at such a rapid rate that it is starting to have an impact on multiple facets of New Zealand. I mean, in terms of the social impacts, environmental impacts, and so on. Not adapting to climate change essentially could well mean the kind of shock that comes to the system that we're getting a glimpse of because of the experience of the coronavirus. You know, we're looking at flights being shut down, countries shutting down, cities shutting down, and so on elsewhere in the world, which has a major impact on New Zealand. So this is in many ways a really good example of what might await if proper adaptation doesn't actually happen.
Also, we can see in the case of the glaciers, for instance, when we talk about one of the things about tourism is that people who have very good experiences in a country often return to that country, right? So you have that. But in the case of the retreating glaciers, for instance, and tourists who've come here many years ago and who've come back for a repeat visit, are completely shocked beyond words to see that it's not what they had seen before. And so some of these impacts you can see, as Priya was saying, already. And so if you magnify that, you can almost imagine what the state will be if we are not prepared, or if the tourism sector is not prepared to adapt to climate change.
Thank you both. A question from Angela Halliday. Who do you think should lead the development of an inclusive strategy at the central government level? And what do you think the role is for local government, individual operators and iwi when it comes to adaptation? That's a large question, Angela.
So that is huge. I think the primary, the primary message, in a sense, from the culture-centered framework that we've articulated is the importance of climate adaptation. For climate adaptation policies to develop and to actually resonate and to be taken up, we need to have deliberative processes in place. And so what that means is that even though we do think that central government does need to take the lead, absolutely, but that's where the resources are, that's where the overarching framework and so on will be in shaping the nature of the policy. It can't be a purely top-down process because that doesn't work. And so each of these actors that you've mentioned, Angela, have a role to play in the deliberative processes, because it is in deliberating and identifying, what local realities are and how that comes up against the scientific knowledge that is being generated, for example, through Deep South, that we can have adaptation policies and strategies that make sense. So it's, I suppose, I'm not sure whether that's an adequate response.
But also, as we were trying to say, that the adaptation strategies would have to be contextual, and that's the reason why you have to have multiple sets of deliberations, and not just a top-down thing that this is one adaptation strategy that the whole country needs to follow, because the realities are different in different parts of the country, and for different communities, and for different tourism sectors too. So the ski industry is not the same as the beach tourism industry in the Coromandel, for instance. It's very different. The contexts are different, and therefore the adaptation strategies have to be different as well. Now, in terms of bringing together all these layers, one of the things from an engagement point of view we found very, very successful is the whole system of citizen panels, for instance, and it's very popular in Europe too, where you bring together a variety of stakeholders and have those deliberations. So it's not a dialogue based. It's not just one-on-one kind of stuff. So you're engaged with a variety of point of views, a variety of contexts, and that's what allows you to distill culture-based adaptation strategies.
Thank you. A question from Tony Rogers at Tourism New Zealand. Did you interview Tier 1 industry operators, for example, Air New Zealand, THL, Sky City, Auckland Airport, etc., as well as the small and medium-sized industry operators?
Yes, we did. And that's one of the findings that we said, that the experiences of the larger enterprises and the small-scale businesses in some cases are dramatically different. So yes, we did meet representatives of almost all of those larger businesses, and also a cross-section of small businesses across both North and South Islands.
Thank you. This is a question from Delphine Herbert. How do we compare in Aotearoa to other countries in terms of our preparedness within the tourism sector?
I think we have to possibly confess that we haven't done, in the we did look at a lot of the literature, but are we up on the latest in terms of climate change adaptation policies of other countries? It's possibly not enough to speak with confidence.
But what we are aware, of course, is that countries that are concerned about the risk to their own cultural identity, for instance, there is a lot of work that's happening. So, the tiny state of Bhutan, for instance, in the Himalayas, they are very, very concerned about the large numbers of tourism and are beginning to put into place ways of monitoring that, even in Botswana, for instance, and there are a few other places.
Right.
Where,
I mean, so Bhutan is a really good example of a country that has deliberately chosen to prioritize what it calls its cultural sustainability over, let's say, economic measures. Have those policies been developed as a response to climate change? Possibly not, but there are lessons to be learned in how countries are shaping their tourism sector to respond to a variety of pressures. And there's a whole range of responses that we can see in Spain, in Italy, in Botswana, as you said, the Galapagos, and so on, where governments are coming in and providing intervention to moderate the way in which the tourism sector operates.
Venice is a classic example too. Climate change is clearly affecting Venice with the repeated floods, as most of you are aware. And the authorities in Venice are beginning to take this very, very seriously. And in fact, they've now decided not to allow cruise ships to come in there. So I think there are countries that are beginning to take note of climate change and are at least thinking about adapting.
And so, although we haven't possibly done a thorough comparison, with other countries, our sense is that New Zealand lags behind in terms of climate change adaptation.
This question follows on slightly from that question. I don't know whether you'll have a response, but do you have examples of, I guess, physical strategies or, strategies that you can point us to, either in New Zealand or around the world, regional strategies for the tourism industry to adapt to climate change?
There probably are, and we would be able to maybe respond in greater depth, maybe via email, just to provide that a more substantive response. I think these places that we have mentioned as places that have started to regulate the tourism sector in a way to respond to, for instance, over-tourism, which is clearly a pressing issue in the case of New Zealand. Other countries and other cities have responded to that. So we could come up with some good exemplars and possibly pass that on to maybe via you, Alex.
Yes. One thing we can definitely do is gather up some material after this seminar and email it out to everyone that was here today. If I'm assuming everyone participating gives their consent for me to contact you in that way. Thank you. A question, we have quite a few questions, so I'm just going to keep plowing through them, but take your time, Debashish and Priya. A question from Sam Parsons. For businesses or industries that are dependent on assets or experiences managed by government agencies, for example, the Dock Great Walks, to what degree do you think the tourism industry sees themselves as having a role in supporting adaptation by central government?
In terms of the responses we got from our interviews and our stakeholder panels and so on, I think there is clearly strong interest expressed in supporting the work that's being done by central government in the management and so on. Beyond that,
but it's a resources issue.
Yeah.
I mean, most of them, especially small businesses, said that they just did not have the resources to be able to do that kind of work. And they're so focused on running their business in the here and now that they're just unable to take that extra step. And that's where I think So when we talked about, deliberation across multiple layers, that's what we mean in some ways, that no one can actually do this just by themselves.
So interest in working with, on things like the Great Walls and so on, but capacity issues were identified by a significant number of our participants. And so I think clearly there needs to be perhaps a mapping out of where resources exist, what kinds of resources are needed, and where collaborative work actually could take this further.
And perhaps scientists would come in as well to see which areas are at greater risk and how and what needs to be done here.
A question from Tony Rogers again, a great question. What do you think, what role do you think the Tier 1 businesses can play from a leadership perspective?
I think first of all, to acknowledge the real threat of climate change. And I think that is still not quite evident. I mean, yes, the Tier 1 businesses, as you call them, are all committed to sustainability, and there are a whole lot of reports that you can see which talk about taking measures, but much of them, I think one of the issues that we found is that they are still limited to high-level kind of aspirations of sustainability, but no clear processes that are put into place to achieve it. And also, as we said in our presentation earlier, that climate change cannot just be merely subsumed under this term of sustainability. Of course, sustainability is important to all of us in the country, but specifically climate change and what the impacts are and what they can do to address those.
I mean, so there is, and there are probably a couple more things to consider. If you look at if you look at a body like Air New Zealand, I mean, the very nature of its business is such that, it's aviation, it's a source of huge emissions. There clearly much more needs to be done in a global sense about regulating and making sense of the carbon emissions associated with the aviation sector. Now, that's not part of the Paris Accord. It comes under a different international sort of agreement and so on. But there are real difficulties, in a sense, in talking about climate change and climate change adaptation while looking at the very nature of the business itself. But at another level, I think these larger Tier 1 organizations do have much greater resources. And so there is real potential, it seems, to provide more of a leadership role in the tourism sector. I mean, I'm not certain, but perhaps there are things like resourcing the smaller operators in the tourism sector to begin to be part of a larger climate change adaptation process for the country as a whole in the tourism sector. So I think, clearly our interviews and our, the data that we have support the view that there is a real sense among many of the players of the importance of this, and there is great scope to develop specific actions around responding directly and immediately to climate change adaptation in terms of a leadership role in the sector itself.
Thank you both. We just have two more questions, and I think that will take us to 11 o'clock or whatever time it is for you over there. So this question from Demelza Jackson: how long have the warning signs been there for the tourism industry, and why have they been ignored?
Warning signals have been there for a very long time. I think the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's report way back in 1997, I think, had raised concerns about the climate change impacts for the tourism sector. So it's been there for a long time, but it's somehow, maybe it's the burying your head in the sand kind of approach, or that, let's look after what's happening today and then we'll think about it tomorrow. I don't know. So why has it been ignored is not something that we can answer. I mean, I suppose.
There is an absence of long-term thinking. And this is something that permeates policymaking generally in the context of, in this case, we're talking about New Zealand, but what's called anticipatory environmental policy, something that's been talked about by Robert Bartlett and Ton Beers in the context of environmental policy, certainly applies in the case of the tourism sector as well. So thinking long-term, thinking in anticipatory ways is something that's been held up as a gold standard. It almost never happens. And that short-term thinking, which is driven by the immediacy of economic benefits, businesses trying to survive, the lack of leadership at the national level. All of that, I think, is part of the reason why we haven't had a proper response on tourism, despite 1997 being the last time that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment,
spelled it out. Yeah, it was explicitly pointed out then, which is, we're talking about 13 years ago now. Oh, no, 23 years ago. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you both. So this is, I'm afraid, the last question. Sorry, Megan Williams, we won't have time to get to your question, but we can answer it on email. And this is a question from Sean I can't pronounce your beautiful Irish last name, Sean. How do we take the urgent action required to counter climate change and at the same time avoid the maladaptation that we see in your example of glacial tourism, moving from walking tours to helicopter tours? And just before I pass the mic back to Debashish and Priya, Sean, one thing I would like to point out is that we have quite a lot of other research in our impacts and implications and in our Vision Mātauranga program that can support this kind of long-term thinking and anticipatory thinking. And one of those projects is the dynamic adaptive decision-making pathways, which is run by Judy Lawrence, and she will be presenting our next seminar on the 1st of April. So please do come along to that, because that sets out some very concrete mechanisms to structure your investment decisions, for example. But I'll pass the mic to Debashish and Priya.
I suppose when we think about helicopter tourism, for instance, how do you prevent something like that? And possibly it calls for the integration of mitigation and adaptation policies in the country. So unless we take seriously the goal of zero carbon, the target of zero carbon emissions by 2050, and 2050, in order to get there by 2050, we need to be acting now, right? And so unless we have some of those frameworks, some of those carbon pricing mechanisms, perhaps, if we are going down the market route, we won't be able to prevent maladaptive strategies. And so it calls for a really clear framework of a framework that shapes and spells out the nature of carbon emissions and the need for a sinking lid in order for maladaptation sort of initiatives to be stopped.
Thank you very much, both of you, and it's wonderful to participate in a seminar that's beginning to bring back together the questions of mitigation and adaptation. And we look forward to making your report public tomorrow, and we will email it out to all of the participants in today's seminar. But once again, thank you. Maybe a little bit of a round of applause from here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.